So let's go back to the fourth panel, which is called for culture change, capturing the military institutional evolution. And for the presenter here and online, a quick reminder, take your time when you're speaking, because we have the translator listening to everything, and sometimes when you speak really fast, they're getting, too much information at the same time. So please take your time when presenting. But we will begin by Isabelle Richer.
Bonjour tout le monde, je vais présenter en français aujourd'hui.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be speaking in French, says the lady. Thank you very much to the hosts for having the resources to have a bilingual symposium. My name is Isabelle Richer. I am a Director General for the Military Personnel Research and Analysis. So I've been at this position as a professional contact and culture chief for 2.5 weeks, and I'm going to talk about the research that we are doing and what we want to do in order to understand how to understand and create concepts with research on culture and the change in cultures.
Donc, les médias, les rapports d'évaluation externe, comme le rapport Beauchamp, le rapport
The media, the various reports like the Beauchamp research and everything that has been done, and the CAF and the DNT really have social cultural issues that are significant and a high prevalence of systemic misconduct, discrimination, sexual misconduct, racism, sexism, inequality, abuse of power, etc. The leaders really recognize the importance of transforming the culture in order to change and go forward, and they really give a lot of resources to all of this. A new organization was created recently called CPCC, Chief Professional Conduct and Culture. We went from 38 people to 400 people in a year and a half, so it really is growing. In order to transform culture in a significant manner, in order to have changes at the very heart of what's at stake, we need to understand the underlying causes of these social cultural issues and systemic misconduct. So it's important to understand what the causes are, what's underneath the problems, the issues, and the causes. So misconduct and unethical behavior have been at the heart of the research for several decades. Usually the research focused on the epidemiology of misconduct, sexual misconduct, discrimination, racism. But to a lesser extent, we do not have a deeper understanding of the influence of the cultures, plural, says the lady, because we're talking about a set of cultures that are underneath the misconduct. We focused on the individual problems and the experiences of the members of the organization. But recent analyses by external researchers really show the importance of oppressive systems and the interrelation with the misconduct, patriarchy, Eurocentrism, colonialism, etc. So we've talked a lot about this, but we never really studied this. So the social aspect of all of this, the more macro aspects, have not been at the very heart of the research. The systemic misconduct and the identity-based facets of oppressive systems are often at the heart of research in silos. So you study the racism or the various problems, but not together, not in a coordinated manner. And so we don't really understand what's at the interface of all of this, the intercorrelation of all of this. we don't really understand the intersectionality of all these components. We don't have a deeper understanding of the various problems.
Donc, dans le processus de développement du programme de recherche pour CPCC,
As part of the process for CPCC, several terms were designed as being a priority, measuring and analyzing the change in culture and the experience of the various people. We also talk about socialization, trust, confidence, and other fields that are studied. Other things really highlight the current understanding of the measurement of culture and of the experience of the members. So we really see that the number of indicators is quantitative. So we really have a lot of different measurements, quantitative measurements on cultures. There's also something else that actually focused on the experience of what was actually experienced, but there were only 37 such studies, including various methods, a lot of interviews, qualitative interviews. So the research on all of this really focused on the systemic stakes, the various people involved, etc., and the capacities that were also talked about. The main objective of my presentation really is to show you, to highlight what's important. The research targeting the lived experience is an entrance to go further in our research and how we can actually get informed on the culture and the change of culture in order to actually work against an oppressive perspective and to really also have transformative, innovative, flexible approaches to really address the complex phenomenon of culture and social inequality. Research on lived experience. As I said, this is an entry point in order to explore, to understand the relationships between the individuals and the social and structural environment, the systems of oppression, and the components of organizational culture. So in order to explore the lived experience, we need to talk to all the members of the defense community. So the minority groups, the marginalized groups, but also the dominant groups, in order to really understand the various resistance or resilience elements, perceptions, the motivations linked to the resilience. We also want to actually prioritize intersectional analyses of complex inequalities. This is really something that's a priority. So always use the intersectional analyses in order to really be able to understand what's going on. So the approach is going to help you understand the way the various systems actually sustain each other and encourage each other. And that's what we want to have a deeper understanding of. So we want to explore the lived experience of the members that have different types of oppression based on their gender, ethnicity, race, sex, gender, language, etc. In our organization, we're also talking about their role, their rank, their occupation. So a lot is at stake right here. And we really want to better understand the mechanisms at the very heart of all these systems. So explore the lived experience of the members of the defense community is going to help us better understand the organizational culture. So we try to conceptualize the research on lived experience as it relates to the social and environmental contexts. So we have the various dimensions: individual, social, institutional, systemic, environmental, and we consider that all these dimensions influence the lived experience of the individuals. It can be useful also to understand the impact of the social environment on the lived experience of systemic misconduct. So at the very bottom of the graphic, the individual dimension, as I explained, it's important to actually understand what goes beyond all of this. So understand that we need to use an intersectional approach. All facets of the defense team member's identity need to be explored in order to understand. The second layer is the interpersonal dimension. For instance, the interactions with the colleagues and the supervisors, the leadership style. The third layer is more of the institution. It's the systems in the organization that can be taken for granted, the beliefs, for instance, that can also be discriminating against some people. And the last layer is the unified hegemonic system of oppression that are part of the social historical context of the organization. So we believe that we can use the lived experience as an entry point to better explore all these concepts in a more holistic manner. The terms that are important for us when it comes to the lived experience is to understand the systemic barriers to diversity and inclusion, the identity and social interactions, the dynamics and mechanisms of culture change, and the research practices and consultation. So really try to understand the way we are going to handle the research on this issue. Anti-oppressive perspective is something that we want to have as a practice. It includes a number of theories and practices based on the dignity of based on human dignity, the defense of rights and freedoms, and social justice. So we want to deconstruct all of this and understand the relationship between the researcher and the participant. We always want to have a critical analysis. Always think about who is asking the question, how we handle the research, who we are talking to in order to develop the research projects throughout the process. We also consider that the various theories are extremely important. The critical social theories, we talked about this in the previous presentations. So here we're talking about the intersectional approaches, the anti-colonial approaches, the critical race theory, the feminist anti-racist theories, the queer critiques, in order to have a better understanding of the oppression and understand everything that is at the very basis of the systems. I'm going to talk about this very quickly. What we want is to adapt our methodological approaches to the complexity of the phenomenon by using a methodology that is transformational. So we want to have methods and an approach that is going to ultimately lead to a change by recognizing the social inequalities and by developing the connection, the relationship of mutual trust between the researcher and the participant. So we really want to be on the side of the people living the inequalities in order to change the status quo.
Par rapport aux approches méthodologiques, il y a aussi la méthode que j'ai mis bricolage, là, mais vraiment
We
comme
also are talking about methods that are flexible,
plusieurs concepts théoriques
that actually lead to various theories where the issue of the research is going to be developed while you are handling the research in order to analyze the data that can be adapted to the complexity of the phenomenon using different artifacts, different modalities That's why we're talking about all of this, in order to have as much material as possible, in order to really dive in the most important questions. Mixed methods are useful in this regard because then you can actually go behind the quantitative and qualitative methods. Ultimately, it is absolutely crucial to better understand the social, institutional, systemic, and even historical underpinnings of cultural issues. It's important to have a research that is focused on the lived experience of all members of the defense team as an entry point in order to better understand the organizational culture and the cultural change. Do the people feel that there is a change in the culture beyond what the measurements is telling us? And we want to challenge traditional research, so promote anti-oppressive research, the intersectional analyses, critical social theories. We want to also have a complementarity between quantitative and qualitative methodologies. And we also need to appreciate the complexity of the phenomenon. It's not just one culture in the culture of defense. I'm talking about cultures, plural, because there are different types of culture. So we need to change the way we are thinking of all of this. That's it. Thank you very much.
Okay, hello everybody, both in the room and then those that are on Zoom. My name is Marshall Gerbrandt. I'm a PhD student at the University of New Brunswick, where I'm focusing on education, and more specifically, education within the CAF, and then I guess even more specifically, that intersection of culture and the classroom. So I had thought long and hard about like, why do I want to do this? And it's exactly what Isabelle said. So it's really great to follow hers, like the why that she captured is why I'm really interested in this. So today I want to talk to you about institutional ethnography and position it as a research method that is well suited to understanding the disconnect between institutional intent and the experiences of individuals. I'll briefly discuss the problem in the Canadian Armed Forces, some research, and then move into this method and finish with an analysis of something that occurred at the Netherlands Defense Academy, where they used this approach to explore the experiences of cadets. So the Canadian Defense Policy, Strong, Secured, Engage, speaks to the strength of having a diverse Canada. But the experience of members in the Canadian Armed Forces is notably different. Over the last 30 years, multiple attempts to integrate various underrepresented groups have arguably failed and can probably be, as Davis says, better described as assimilation as opposed to integration. When we look at recent literature, George describes the military as masculine, white, and heterosexual. Tabor expands upon this and describes it as a militarized or a hyper-masculine militarized culture, and identifies issues with the warrior narrative and how that's problematic. And I think to simplify it, the warrior narrative is all things that are not feminine. And by promoting masculine traits, it is demoting everything that is not that idealized warrior, which arguably very few, if any, can meet. When we look at other research that's been conducted in the CAF, Tabor speaks to the hidden curriculum, both during her time at the Royal Military College of Canada, but also when she was in an operational Air Force squadron, and the informal ways in which you learn how to adapt and fit into the organization you're in. So given the priority placed upon changing the Canadian Armed Forces culture by senior leadership, there's a need to further examine experiences of members. And in response to these issues, the institution has responded in an attempt to change its culture. There is a number of different issues or initiatives that have been spoken to today, and I'll just highlight the recently released Canadian Armed Forces Ethos, Trusted to Serve. And it defines culture change as developing an environment of mutual respect, dignity, and inclusion for all members. Two key things that I draw out of it is it identifies the importance of education and training for leaders, and that it emphasizes the important role that leaders have in shaping culture. So while it expands and refines concepts from duty with honor, which I understand is also undergoing its own revisions, it drops the warrior narrative and it kind of describes how members ought to act. I wonder, how does this actually manifest in the classrooms? This is a great institutional text, but so what? What does it mean for the RMC cadets in your classroom, the private soldiers, I don't know, in the back of a lab? And so with that, I sought to look at where does leadership and education intersect? And while I'm going to speak to the Royal Military College as an example, I think you could easily translate this to the Canadian Forces College, which is responsible for training senior officers, the OSIT Institute, which does the same with senior non-commissioned officers, and arguably anywhere else that military members sit in a classroom and learn how to be leaders. So the Royal Military College, not immune to the same issues that were identified in the Deschamps and subsequently the Arbor report. Oh, I haven't pushed this once, have I? All right, so I do apologize for that. There we go. And here we go. RMC produces about 30% of CAF officers. And if we go back to trusted to serve, leaders have the most significant impact on CAF culture. So I view it as an intersection of leadership and education within the military. So if on one side we have the Canadian Armed Forces ethos, and on the other side we have the classroom, I wonder, what is the disconnect between them? Or to what extent is there a disconnect between intent and experience? And I think institutional ethnography is well positioned to explore that. So what is institutional ethnography? Institutional ethnography begins in the everyday lives of people. It examines how the institutional structures and practices shape and organize those experiences. It focuses on understanding the organized social settings as they're organized by text, by policy, by the written word. And it emerged in the early 80s as a result of Dorothy Smith's experience with traditional sociologies. And essentially, she found that sociology was losing perspectives on the participants, and the participants of research were moving from being the subject of research to being an object of research. So one of the central tenets of this is maintaining a standpoint or that perspective or that entry point into a lived experience of your participant. It focuses on their actual work. It focuses on the experience and the connections of their everyday lives. But then it steps away from that individual to understand how what they do, why they do it, when they do it, is coordinated by the institutional texts, the documents, the policies, the curriculum, all those artifacts which, whether visibly or invisibly, coordinate the way in which we go upon our lives. It seeks to show how these experiences are socially organized. And there's a few key terms I'll highlight here because they'll come into play when I explore the NLDA example. So there's standpoint, which is essentially a point of view. It's a point of departure for when you begin your exploration. There's the problematic, and that's the puzzle. That's the disjuncture between what an institution intends and what is actually experienced by those living or operating within the institution. And then there's finally the ruling relations. And she likens that to all the connections that are happening between policy and an individual, between individuals and their peers, their superiors. It's everything that you are experiencing and the way in which it's interrelated. So if we look at the Netherlands Defense Academy, a few years ago, Jensen, as part of their doctoral work, and Kramer explored the experience of cadets. And when they first analyzed the research, they found that the vast majority of literature examining military academies focused on the institution. It focused on the academy as opposed to the actual cadets' experience. So what they sought to do was understand how education is a dynamic process between the cadet and the institution, and they wanted to open that black box, their words, not mine, of military education and really understand what was going on there. So they adopted institutional ethnography as their method. They selected the cadets as their standpoint, and then they commenced about 18 months worth of ethnographical research. Starting at the end of an academic year, they interviewed cadets, military and civilian faculty and staff, to understand the situation, to gain a sense of what the issues were. And this is likened to an initial inquiry. They want to set the stage to know what they will research and how they narrow their focus. Then, as a new batch of recruits came in, they followed a group of infantry officers over the course of a year. They conducted individual interviews, focus groups. They participated alongside them for various activities, whether it was through hazing. That was the word they used there. And what I liken to, and not being a member of RMC, is when you go through your obstacle course at the beginning, as opposed to maybe some of the more negative connotations of hazing. They followed them on overnight training exercises. And what they found as they were going through this is they were identifying what cadets were doing linked to institutional policy. And then they began their exploration of curriculum, academy documents, overarching military documents to see the how and why. And what this led them to finding is essentially two paradoxes. And they describe it as perfect imperfection and individual in the system. And so I was a former military member, so the perfect imperfection stood out to me. And this was both for them as the military, their academy, and as an individual, you are the best of the best. We are the best of the best. We stand above everyone else. And it followed along that sort of rhetoric. But the longer they were in, they started to see the cracks. You know, their infrastructure wasn't very good. Their food wasn't very good. Their instructors were late. But if you're perfect, you're not late to classes. And they started to see the differences between what the institution says it ought to be and what it actually is. Then there was individual in the system. And this is the conflict between instructors and staff telling them to, be the best as an individual. You as an individual bring great skills to this organization, but at the same time, you must conform. You must do the same thing as everybody else. And the real interesting part that Jensen and Kramer found is how the cadets navigated this, how there was essentially a hidden curriculum or an informal way to learn which rules ought to be followed versus which don't. When you don't follow the rules, which ones will get you, at what time will that get you in trouble versus at what time that won't. And in a military institution, they found this might be problematic for members to decide when they ought to follow rules and when they won't. So before I move on to my CAF example, I think what institutional ethnography provided Jensen and Kramer, as opposed to other researches such as a case study or maybe other qualitative approaches, was a chance to really explore the disconnect between what students experienced, what the institution said they ought to experience, what they ought to be, and it allowed them to dig deeper into those discrepancies as written by policies and other textual documents. So what this brings me to, and I've managed to click it on both slides, which makes me happy, is what I consider the CAF connection. And this speaks to my doctoral research and where I'm hoping to go. And I would like to understand that disconnect between trusted to serve and the various other documents that are coming out that speak to culture change within the Canadian Armed Forces and the lived experiences of members. So as an example, I would use the standpoint of an RMC cadet or cadets. But as I said earlier, I think you could transpose that to any other number of leadership settings to explore a similar problem, but from just a different perspective. I would want to understand how trusted to serve, how the ethos of the CAF is being delivered formally within their educational setting, how they are occurring it informally, both in the ways that they're acting, the way their professors are acting, the ways in which they deal with different situations as it relates to the policies and procedures to understand, is the CAF getting to where it wants to be based off of what it is published as an institutional text? Is there a disconnect? If so, what is causing that disconnect? Or does trusted to serve just serve as lip service? And the status quo is continuing to be reproduced at every other level. So with that, I conclude and ready to hand it over.
So thank you, Marshall. And for our last panelist, we have Dr. Tamir Libel and Dr. Krystal Hackey virtually with us.
All right, so I'll get started. So we have time at the end for any questions. First of all, I just want to say thank you to the organizers giving us the opportunity to present this work. And also to the panelists before me, it was really interesting listening to your talks on this area. So the presentation I'm doing today, so first of all, I guess I should have said, my name is Krystal Hackey. While I'll be presenting the work today, it's actually Dr. Libel who has done the impetus for this work that I'm supporting. So specifically on tracing institutional change in the officer corps using textual data analysis from a military school, promise, pitfalls, and ethical considerations. I've had a great chance to work with Tamir over the last couple of years, and so this is kind of the latest work that we're working together on. Let's see there we go. So just to mention, what I'll be presenting today is really presenting partial results. So of course, if you need to cite the information or please feel free to contact us so that we'll have more final results kind of moving forward, but definitely looking forward to your feedback today. So in terms of the background, I'll provide just a little context as to the impetus for the study. So the officer corps holds hegemonic power and leadership position within the armed forces. There's hierarchical divisions between junior, mid-career, and senior officers. And of course, the upward mobility from junior rank officers to general officers often involves mandatory periodic attendance at professional military education organizations. So usually this is critical to equip officers with the attitudes, norms, and expert knowledge required for executing their duties. So given their position in the armed forces and their critical role in organizational functioning, battlefield performance, and civil military relations, there is a scientific and policy-oriented need to understand the sociological composition, attitudes, and expertise of the officer corps. So direct analysis of the officer corps is often hindered due to a lack of publicly available data or obviously limited prohibited access to the military. So PME organizations are sometimes used as proxies to study the officer corps, either in terms of two areas, assessing the sociological profile, or as a way to analyze military expertise. But of course, using PME organizations as proxies bring us a couple of challenges. So first of all, in terms of conceptual flaws, PME organizations and the officer corps are not defined. The mechanism or mechanisms and relationships between them are not necessarily outlined, and the expected results are not specified. So this makes falsifiability of the research questions impossible and results in sometimes indeterminate research designs. The other aspect is with regards to data availability. So data are either not publicly available, like I had mentioned, limited, prohibited by the armed forces, or expensive. And of course, sometimes just the availability varies across services, countries, and years. So this brings us to the aim of the current study. So in the paper that we're working on, we're trying to outline a new conceptual framework and an analytical strategy overcoming the conceptual, methodological, and data challenges mentioned that we mentioned on the previous slides. So specifically, it actually builds on and extends on Dr. Libel's work on the reconceptualization of officership and PME as distinct, although interrelated institutions embedded structurally in the officer corps and PME organizations respectively. It also implements a social science data method for data collection and analysis. So this includes an automated data collection to conduct large-scale, inexpensive data collection, also using machine learning algorithms. This way we can infer information from data which are not necessarily directly provided from the data, so gender, for example, and ethnicity. As well as using unsupervised learning algorithms. And this is to analyze the collected corpus of text in its entirety, exposing unobserved latent dimensions. So in this case, using PME as an organization as a proxy to test whether institutional change can be observed. So for example, this can happen either at the officer corps or officership. And here we define it as institution. So the PME organization that we actually selected for this kind of exploratory study is the U.S. Army School of Advanced Military Studies, or SAMS, and it's dedicated to prepare the future elite of the U.S. military, Army, It is uniquely positioned to assess changes in the PME institution of the US Army because it's structurally positioned almost like a bottleneck in the selection and education of the future military elite. So in terms of some of the conceptual considerations for the current exploratory study, again, we're drawing on Dr. Libel's PME and officership definitions as interrelated institutions. So here in this case, institution is defined as the social rules, norms, and ideas that guide but also restrain social behavior. The PME institution and officership are conceptualized as institutions within the framework of historical institutionalism. So this is the emphasis on the temporality of analysis and the cruciality of critical junctures. So in this case, our specific definitions for PME institution are an institution which sets the social rules, norms, and ideas for the organization tasked with the education of officers, and officership as the expertise, attitudes, ethics, and rules which constitutes the commission command within the armed forces. I'll try to speak slower. I realize I'm speaking quite fast. So analyzing kind of the social, and the social dimension would be gender and ethnicity, and the ideational dimensions, which would be the topics of study at SAMS, for example, of the PME organization, can potentially indicate a change in the institution. So here we're saying a change in one dimension could be a change in the institution itself, and a change in two dimensions may be a change of the institution. So this observed change can be a proxy for change in the officer corps, so change only in the social dimension of the PME institution, or change in officership, so change only in the ideational dimension of the PME institution. Of course, the relationship between change of the PME institution or organization and change in or of officership has yet to be fully explored or determined. So what have we done in terms of the current study? So first of all, we started off with web scraping of large-scale research monograph data from the School of Advanced Military Studies, as I had mentioned. So that included 3,944 research monographs written by roughly 3,000 authors. So we used gender and ethnicity inference using R packages based on first names and last names. So we inferenced gender using gender and gender guesser R packages, and of ethnicity using our ethnicity R package. We also use structural topic model analysis, or STM, in R to trace changes in the corpus latent dimensions conditioned by covariates. So in terms of the social dimension, so the gender facet, inferring author's gender based on their first name. The pre-processing included, we had authors' names that were clean and converted to the format of, last name, first name, and then the first name was extracted into a new variable. In terms of the inference, we used our packages, gender and gender guesser were used to infer authors' gender based on their first names. And we also used different data sources in this sense, the gender package, which came from the American Social Security Administration, which is an official data source. And then the gender guesser package we used, which was using a commercial data source. So I'm going to, over the next following slides, I'm just going to provide, again, some partial results. And of course, we're still working through this and kind of a lot of the discussion and considerations that need to be considered for this current study. So as you'll see here, this is the first table on the gender variables. So the main difference between the results from the algorithms and the human coders is the size of actually the missing data. It is the largest for variable gender 1 in that first column, which relied on official data, and smaller for variable 2, which relied on the commercial data source. But both are significantly higher than the 7 non-applicables from the human coders. So what I mean by 7 non-applicables is this is when we were coding the names, they didn't provide the actual full name, and it was just either a letter or they didn't provide a full name. So variable gender 1 inferred 177 cases as female. This is identical to the result from the human coders, and variable gender 2 identified 10 less cases as female. The authors should still look at, so we should still look at whether gender one and the human coders actually attributed the same cases with female. So I guess that's the thing that we need to consider. The identical number of cases identified as female to that of the human coders, together with the higher number of non-applicables, resulted in actually a noticeably smaller number of cases identified as males comparing to either gender 2 or the human coders. So unfortunately, real world data was only available for 4 years so that we could do our comparisons. As can be seen, neither of the gender inference algorithms results here are accurate, but they both seem to be a reasonable approximation in regard to male cadets. And they are both quite overestimating the result for the number of female students in 2004 in the first row. Gender 2 may perform better on this account for the remaining years. You know, to move this forward in terms of our validation, more data needs to be collected. And so we're looking at collecting more data for the remaining years. And so potential validation via statistical analysis would obviously also be ideal, because in this case, validation was only a visual inspection of the actual data. So in terms of these two graphs, again, based on the highly limited real world data that we had to do a validity check of the gender inference, it does seem that the algorithms provide a reasonable approximation of the gender distribution. The overall distribution of gender distribution per year is overall similarly across the algorithms. In spite of the gradual increase in the total number of students over the years, the proportion of female students to the total number of students per year stayed more or less the same. So this would indicate that no technical change took place in the gender facet or the social dimension of the PME organization. And this specific PME organization is SAMS for those years. So in terms of the ideational dimension, so these are the topics, these are the top topics, the top 5 topics of thesis of the corpus that were from SAMS. So while the STM algorithm are able to look at kind of the latent dimensions, the shared topic strings of words in their base form, it does give us the possibility of looking at the corpus as a whole when we're doing it this way. So on the other hand, there's a need for subject matter expertise to understand the meaning of some of the topics. So the uniqueness of STM comparing to the other topic modeling algorithms is its ability to evaluate how covariate, so variables such as gender or year, influence the proportions of topics across documents. So you can see kind of the different topics, but you will, just as a note, you'll see that topic 15 is clearly partially included as a mistake. So some of them are non-meaningful words, but the meaningful words do point to command and war as the topic. So STM also has tools for assessing the impact of discrete and continuous covariates on the prevalence of topics. So here we can see how the prevalence of the top 5 topics that were on the last slide has changed over the years. Year was treated as a continuous variable rather than as a time object here. But we can see topic 10 experienced a sharp decline while the others had mild to sharp increases over the years. So based on these partial results, what does that tell us? So the initial results suggest that no change took place in the gender facet of the social dimension of SAMS, while significant change took place in the ideational dimension of the school. So again, based on our conceptual considerations, it's an indication of change in the US Army's PME institution. The initial results are also based on ability to check of the gender inference algorithm's results. So again, we only were able to get a very limited real world data to really compare those results. And in terms of a validation, only visual inspection was possible here. The STM results indicate that a significant change took place on the ideational dimension, increased emphasis on command and PME, as well as the significance of strategic policymaking and non-high intensity conflict. So in terms of the actual methods we use, the R package provides a detailed diagnostic tools for selection of a number of topics, model and inspection of topics. And validation is with here, as I mentioned, is a judgment call based on subject matter expertise. So what does this tell us moving forward, and what are we currently working on in terms of addressing some of our considerations? So obviously the initial results demonstrate the utility of using this conceptual framework and outlining the analytical strategy for the analysis of PME organizations and looking at that over time. Specifically in terms of the algorithms, it does demonstrate the potential of social data science tools to extract information from seemingly limited types of data, such as the SAMS data that we used. So research monographs and their metadata. Of course, validation is very central. We mentioned this before, we only were able to do a visual review of the data. While the suggested approach is intended to overcome some of those data limitations that we had mentioned earlier on in the slide deck, its validation is dependent on access to obviously relevant real world data. And of course, some of the other areas of concern are some ethical issues. So inference about gender and ethnicity of people, of course, although based on publicly available data, definitely raises some privacy and ethical considerations because that's not how the data was initially collected. And of course, gender and ethnicity inference using predetermined categories without consideration to individual self-definition is definitely another ethical issue that we need to consider as we move forward with these algorithms. And I think that's it for me. Perfect. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
So as you saw, there was a different of methodology, but I thought it was interesting to see both way to looking at education when it comes to military institutions. So I don't think we have any question by our virtual attendee, but we have one in presence.
Thank you for the panel presentations. My question is for Marshall. So you're looking at RMC, at Royal Military College of Canada, and although it is a military college or academy, if it was in the States, it is not technically a professional military education institution. In fact, as you pointed out, you said 30%, depending, I guess, on the year, it could be only 25% of officers are produced through the ROTP. Then there is another greater percentage that actually do not go through the regular officer training plan, but they're direct entry officers and other entry plans. So there's two issues there that I may forward for consideration as you move forward. One is that you're looking at a small proportion of the whole officer corps. And then furthermore, the officers, as we know, are also a smaller proportion as non-commissioned members that are actually the larger portion of the other Canadian Armed Forces. And because really the education, if we're looking at the education of the 4 pillars, right? So it's considered a 4-pillar degree. So the academic pillar, technically we as professors, this is myself, Tanya is here, for example, or even our military, even the military faculty, we are delivering academic education. So comparable, you know, hopefully to other institutions in Ontario and in Canada. So the only part, I think, where you could see the parallel with doctrine, right, such as the ethos trusted to serve, would be potentially in the leadership pillar that is really delivered by the military wing, not the academic wing. So I'm just struggling with how you're going to find those parallels in the classroom because we are not delivering doctrine. However, in an institution such, say, the Canadian Forces College, where we are educating, that is 100% a professional military education institution, but we are doing it sort of a mix of some academic and some professional military education that's very prescriptive. And that's within those programs, you're going to find more of that relevance in the classroom, where we have to be in line with such things as the trusted to serve. So I'm just struggling with doing that kind of research within an institution that is really not delivering PME per se in the academic wing anyways.
Yeah, that's a great point. And we had a bit of a discussion last night over that. And so while I recognize that RMC does only produce a smaller percentage of the officers as a whole, one of the things I was thinking about is it is the institution that the CAF owns. And that I do understand that difference between the academic and the military wings. But I would have to assume that as an institution, we would want to see the CAF ethos and values across all aspects of RMC being taught and delivered, and not necessarily directly. Some of it might be more informally in the way in which professors deal with their peers, deal with their students, as opposed to the more formal way that perhaps the military faculty or the military advisors do it. And one of the other considerations I gave to RMC as I was trying to rationalize, well, how could you look at this from an NCM perspective, given that they are just the bulk of the forces? They are most likely to experience the issues, most likely to perpetrate the issues, just by sheer numbers. Where is a good place to explore them? And I don't know whether it is CFLRS or if it is later at the OSIT Institute, where they have been in the institution much longer. And then one of the other considerations is, so post JCSP, the vast majority of those officers are going to head off into staff roles. Very few of them are going to immediately go back to command, whereas leaving RMC, those are the second lieutenants and lieutenants that will, by and large, be leading soldiers and be ideally reinforcing the change in the culture that they want to see. So all that to say is I don't know if RMC makes the most sense. Like, I have some ideas of why I think it does, but your points on PME from CFC are like, they absolutely make sense, because that's also a really good point where those are people who are committed to the institution and they want to remain in for one way or another. And you're getting that pan-CAF services type of audience to explore. Well, lots of things to think about.
We have another question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you to the panelists, and Marshall, my comments are directed to you. First of all, I found your presentation very interesting, and I would love to follow your research. So I hope we can maintain contact after this. And secondly, I hope you don't feel Grace and I are ganging up on you, but I want to make some observations. I'm presently the chair of the Cultural Change Steering Committee at the college. So I've been observing a lot of the training and education, plus I was military faculty for 16 years. So I'm relatively familiar. There's some areas that I'm just learning about, but the nuances between the education and training is very important. The training wing will teach the doctrine. There is some subtle examination of doctrine and other professional requirements in some of the cultural classes, and I'm thinking French culture and literature and English culture and literature, mainly through looking at novels, situations presented them, and so forth. And they may integrate some aspects of doctrine. Military psychology and leadership will address a lot of these in the core courses that the students take, and they explore the ethical elements. But one of the problems is familiarity and delivery amongst the training wing. And I hope I'm speaking on a privileged platform here. Because first of all, their exposure to the doctrine is limited. And secondly, having sat through a lot of this training through the autumn, and first year orientation program is the thing you were thinking about with the obstacle course. Okay. It's the nuances, it's the rolling of the eyes, the body language when they deliver it, which is as dangerous as not knowing the doctrine. And that's something that has to be worked up. So we're playing with maybe creating a new faculty that will explore these things, and maybe a fifth pillar that will help out with it. So I think it's good to look at the college, but remember, this starts with basic training, goes through the college, and follows you through your career. You continue to explore this and develop within it. So thank you very much.
2 PhD theses. But now, sorry, I'm not able to take more questions, but thank you very much. It was so interesting. Thank you, Krystal. And sorry to not have time to ask you a question because I have, and I will send it to you. But now it's time for the break, and they should have new coffee. And also, I was told delicious cookies outside. So let's be back in 15 minutes.